The marble halls of the Galactic Assembly Station floated in space above a neutral world called Centris Prime. And this place had seen 10,000 years of peace and cooperation between alien species from across the galaxy. But today, something different was happening in its grand circular council chamber, where 200 alien representatives sat in their designated spots, while Ambassador Helen Carter stood at the center wearing her dark blue Earth uniform and looking calm, even though the debate had been going on for 6 straight hours with no end in sight. Helen was a tall woman with sharp eyes and black hair tied back in a professional style, and she had been Earth's ambassador to the Assembly for 3 years now. But in all that time she had never seen the council chamber this angry before, as alien voices rose and fell in waves of sound that the translation devices in everyone's ears struggled to keep up with, because so many species were talking at once in their own languages. Speaker Vorath stood at the highest platform in the chamber, and his body was made of crystal that caught the light and threw rainbows across the walls. But right now, those colors looked angry, as he raised one crystalline arm for silence and said in a voice that echoed through the chamber that the human delegation was refusing to follow Resolution 8847. And this was something that had never happened before in all the long history of the Galactic Assembly. Behind Helen stood 2 other humans from Earth, and Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison was a military officer with steady hands and a face that showed nothing of what he was thinking, while Dr. Lisa Chang was a scientist who had come along to provide technical expertise about the matter they were discussing, and both of them could feel the tension in the room like a physical weight pressing down on their shoulders. The resolution that Speaker Vorath kept talking about was demanding that humanity hand over all the technical details of their faster-than-light drive system, because the Assembly Council members had voted and decided that human technology was destabilizing to the established order, whatever that meant, and Helen had read the resolution 10 times trying to find some reasonable compromise in its words, but there was none to be found. Helen raised her voice so everyone could hear and said with respect to the speaker that humanity had discovered their method of traveling faster than light on their own, without any help from the Assembly, and Earth had already shared the basic principles freely with everyone just like Assembly law required. But what the Council was demanding now was complete surrender of all technical specifications and an agreement to stop developing new improvements. And that was not cooperation or partnership, but something else entirely. The chamber exploded with noise as aliens of every shape and size started shouting, and the Threxians, who looked like giant insects, clicked their jaw parts together in anger, while the Valorians, who were clouds of gas inside containment suits, turned dark red with rage, and even the normally calm Dalthians who breathed water instead of air made hissing sounds through the gill slits on their necks. A council member named Threx, who represented the Merchant Coalition, leaned forward on his floating platform, and his multiple eyes focused on Helen as he said in a voice that carried across the noise that humanity had only been part of the Assembly for 30 years, which was nothing compared to the thousands of years that other species had been members. And humans simply did not have the wisdom to understand why their technology was dangerous. Helen felt something hot rise in her chest, but she kept her voice level and professional as she replied that Earth might be young in the Assembly, but their faster-than-light drives had caused 0 accidents and 0 deaths, and had opened 12 new trade routes that benefited everyone, while meanwhile the Vraxian Gate incident last year had killed 4,000 beings because the Assembly refused to update safety systems that were hundreds of years out of date. Counselor Mara, who was from the Vraxian species, stood up fast, and her body was covered in scales that now stood on end, making her look twice as large as she really was. And she said in a dangerous voice that Helen dared to bring up the gate incident when everyone knew that tragedy had happened because someone leaked unauthorized technology modifications, and the Assembly security forces suspected that humans were involved. Jake Morrison stepped forward before Helen could respond and said clearly that suspicions without evidence meant nothing, and Earth had provided complete security records 3 separate times already. So either the Council should file formal charges or stop making accusations that had no proof behind them. Speaker Vorath slammed his crystal arm down on his podium, and the sound was like glass shattering into a million pieces, and he declared that the Assembly had voted, and the decision was final, and humanity would comply with Resolution 8847 within 30 standard cycles or face economic sanctions and travel restrictions throughout all Assembly space. Helen looked around at the faces and forms that filled the chamber, some familiar after 3 years and some still strange to her human eyes. And she remembered how 30 years ago, when Earth had first made contact with alien life, the whole planet had celebrated with tears of joy running down people's faces, and humanity had been so eager to join the Galactic Assembly and take their place among the civilized species of the galaxy. But every year since then had brought new rules and new restrictions and new demands that Earth stay small and quiet and grateful for being allowed to exist alongside the older species. Helen took a deep breath and said in a voice that somehow carried through the sudden silence that humanity must respectfully decline to follow the resolution. Speaker Vorath's crystal body flickered with confusion, and he said that declining was not possible because assembly resolutions were binding on all member species. Helen said that humans could decline, and they did decline. And furthermore, she was authorized to announce that effective immediately, humanity was withdrawing from the Galactic Assembly, and Earth would maintain peaceful relations with any species that wanted the same. But humanity would not be controlled and would not surrender their sovereignty, and would not apologize for being good at what they did. She touched the communication device on her wrist and said clearly that Commander Sullivan should execute Protocol Freedom right now. A man's voice came back through the device and was broadcast on all the Assembly's communication channels saying that he acknowledged the order and would proceed immediately. Around the Centris Prime system where the Assembly station orbited, 30 human military ships that had been on routine patrol suddenly activated their drives, but instead of the normal blue shimmer that everyone knew from standard faster-than-light travel, the human ships vanished in flashes of silver light and were gone in less than a second. And at the same moment, every human embassy on 24 different worlds began emergency evacuation procedures while communication channels went dark, and trade agreements were formally dissolved through rapid legal documents. The council chamber descended into complete chaos with aliens shouting and demanding explanations and asking what was happening. Helen turned to Jake and Lisa and said simply that they were leaving right now. As the 3 humans walked toward the exit, Counselor Venn from the Peaceful Accord rushed forward on his short legs, and his bulbous eyes were wide with something that looked like fear, as he said that Ambassador Carter needed to reconsider, because without the Assembly's protection, humanity would be vulnerable to predator species and hostile factions and dangers that Earth could not even imagine. Helen stopped at the doorway and looked back at the small alien who seemed genuinely worried. And she said that humanity had not crawled out of caves and survived ice ages and split the atom and reached the stars by looking for protection from others, and humans had been handling dangers since before Venn's species built their first primitive shelter, and Earth would manage just fine on its own. The 3 humans left the chamber and the door closed behind them with a soft sound that somehow felt final. Speaker Vorath watched them go, and his crystal body dimmed with an emotion he had not felt in 3,000 years, and it took him a long moment to recognize what it was, because fear was not something that Assembly leaders experienced very often. But there it was anyway, cold and undeniable in whatever passed for his heart. Captain Ryan Hughes stood on the bridge of the Earth Defense Force vessel Independence and watched the tactical display screen with a feeling of satisfaction mixed with tension, because this was the moment that would decide whether Earth's bold move would succeed or fail completely. And around his ship, the entire Sol defense fleet had spread out, creating a protective barrier that stretched from the hot surface of Mercury all the way out to the frozen rocks of the Kuiper Belt at the edge of the solar system. Navigation Officer Kate Summers looked up from her station and reported that the Galactic Assembly vessels were holding their position just outside the heliosphere, which was the bubble of space that the sun's influence created, and they were not advancing toward Earth, but they were not leaving either. Just sitting there like they were trying to decide what to do next. Ryan asked how many ships were out there, and Kate checked her sensors before answering that there were 47 vessels total, and they represented a mixed fleet with different species and different types of warships, all grouped together like someone had assembled them in a hurry without much planning. Ryan allowed himself a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes and asked about the status of the new defense platforms that Earth had been building in secret for the past 5 years. Lieutenant Chris Ward at the tactical station said that all 300 platforms were online and fully armed with weapon systems that the Assembly had no idea existed, and their intelligence was still based on Earth technology from 5 years ago. which meant they had no clue what they were really facing if they decided to start a fight. That was the secret that humanity had kept hidden, while they pretended to be junior partners in the assembly, and while Earth had publicly shared basic information about their faster-than-light drives as required by law. Human scientists had been making breakthrough after breakthrough in private laboratories and research stations, and the drives that human ships use now were not just a little bit better than assembly technology, but orders of magnitude more efficient and more reliable, and more versatile in ways that would shock the alien species if they knew. The communications officer announced that there was an incoming transmission from Admiral Preston at Fleet Command back on Earth, and Ryan said to put it on the main screen. Admiral Linda Preston appeared, and her silver hair and lined face showed the experience of 40 years in Earth's military service, and she asked Captain Hughes if his sector was secure. Ryan confirmed that it was, and said the assembly fleet was maintaining their distance for now. Linda's expression became harder, and she said she was about to make things very interesting, and she told the communications officer to open a channel to the assembly vessels on all frequencies so everyone could hear what she had to say. A moment passed while the channel connected, and then Admiral Preston addressed the waiting alien fleet in a voice that carried absolute authority and said that she was Admiral Linda Preston of the Earth Defense Force, and the assembly ships were currently violating the Sol system's newly established borders, and they had exactly 1 hour to withdraw beyond the boundary of the Oort cloud, or any vessel that remained would be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly. The response came fast, and Counselor Threx's insect face appeared on the split screen looking angry, as he said that the Admiral could not enforce such a claim because the Assembly had free navigation rights throughout all charted space according to treaties that went back thousands of years. Linda corrected him and said those rights existed in the past tense because those agreements had ended the moment humanity withdrew from the Assembly, and this was Earth's sovereign space, which was recognized under the Sentient Species Rights Convention that was older than the Assembly itself, and which the Council could not legally override no matter how much they wanted to. Another alien commander appeared on screen, and his reptilian features twisted with contempt as he said that humanity was bluffing because Earth lacked the military capability to enforce such bold claims against the combined might of the Assembly. Linda's smile was cold and dangerous as she asked if he would like to test that theory, and she said that Earth had 200 warships and 300 autonomous defense platforms and technology that the Assembly had not seen yet because her people had been very busy for the past 10 years, while everyone else was not paying attention. She made a gesture towards someone off-screen, and the tactical display shifted to show a new image that appeared on every assembly ship's view screen at the same time, and it showed a massive station near Jupiter that was covered with weapon systems, and generating a power signature so strong that several of the alien commanders gasped when they saw the readings. Linda explained that this was the Citadel Defense Station, which had been completed just last month, and was one of 5 such stations positioned throughout the solar system, and the Assembly had been so focused on trying to control Earth's faster-than-light drives that they never noticed humans building the most advanced defensive network in known space, right under their noses. She said that the Assembly fleet now had 59 minutes remaining, and suggested they use that time wisely, and then she ended the transmission without waiting for a response. Ryan watched the Assembly fleet carefully through his sensors, and for 10 long minutes nothing happened as the alien commanders presumably argued among themselves about what to do. And then one by one the vessels began to withdraw with their drives flickering as they retreated beyond the designated boundary line that Earth had established. Kate confirmed that the Assembly fleet was withdrawing, and Ryan acknowledged the report, but told everyone to stay alert, because this situation was not over by any measure. It was only just beginning. Meanwhile, on Earth itself, in a chamber carved deep into the Rocky Mountains, Secretary General Marcus Webb stood before the United Earth Council in an emergency session that had been called the moment Ambassador Carter had announced the withdrawal, and the chamber was packed with council members from every nation and territory that made up the unified Earth government. Marcus began by saying that humanity was now officially alone among the stars, and the question before the council was simple: had Ambassador Carter made the right decision? Council member Patricia Green stood up immediately and said with respect to the Secretary General that this was not really about right or wrong, but about survival. and the assembly had been slowly strangling Earth with restrictions that got tighter every year. And every time humans made a breakthrough, the assembly demanded that Earth hand over the technology, and they wanted humanity to remain dependent and inferior forever. Another council member named Zhou Chen argued that Earth had thrown away 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge and peaceful cooperation, and surely there had been room to negotiate some kind of compromise. Patricia shot back that Earth had tried negotiating for 3 full decades, and it had gotten them nowhere because the assembly did not see humans as equals, and never had. And to them, Earth was just a novelty or a useful tool, but never a true partner. Marcus raised his hand for silence and said that regardless of personal opinions, the decision had been made, and now the council needed to deal with the consequences, and he asked Dr. Alan Price, who directed the Global Research Initiative, to give the scientific community's assessment of the situation. Dr. Price stood and activated a holographic display that showed various charts and data, as he explained that the assessment was surprisingly optimistic, because while Earth would lose access to assembly databases, human scientists had already copied and analyzed 70% of the relevant information over the past 30 years, and more importantly, Earth's own research had been advancing faster than assembly science in multiple fields for quite some time now. He said that human scientists had actually been dumbing down their research papers to match assembly expectations, so they would not seem too threatening, and murmurs of surprise went through the council chamber at this revelation. Alan continued, and said that Earth's faster-than-light technology was now confirmed to be the most advanced in known space by a significant margin, and humans had also made major breakthroughs in energy generation and materials science and artificial intelligence. And the truth was that Earth did not need the assembly for technology, and never really had. Marcus asked what the economic impact would be, and Commerce Director Lisa Hamilton took the floor to explain that Earth would take a hit in the short term, because assembly trade had accounted for 18% of interstellar commerce, but most of that was raw materials that could be sourced independently, and Earth had already been developing alternative supply chains in secret, and within 6 months Earth would be completely self-sufficient, and within a year would actually be better off than before. Marcus nodded slowly and asked about the military situation, and General Frank Morrison, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, stood with the rigid posture that came from a lifetime of military service, and said that the assembly had more total ships than Earth by a large margin, but human technology was superior and Earth crews were better trained, and humans had the advantage of fighting in their home territory, and if the assembly wanted a war, it would cost them more than they could afford to pay. On the massive trading hub called Merchant's Gate, which was a space station that served as the commercial heart of the entire galactic assembly, panic was spreading faster than light itself through the corridors and trading floors where beings from 100 worlds conducted business every single day. Station Master Dreln sat at his control center watching holographic displays that kept flashing red with cancellation notices, and human traders were pulling out of contracts while human transport ships were leaving their docking bays, and human financial institutions were freezing assembly accounts and demanding immediate payment of all outstanding debts. Dreln's assistant Vora stood beside him with her tentacles trembling as she whispered that this was a complete disaster, because humans handled 42% of all shipping logistics for the station, and she asked how they were supposed to replace that much capacity on short notice. Dreln said flatly that they could not replace it at all, at least not quickly, because the humans had been so quiet and efficient that no one had realized just how much of the economy depended on them keeping things running smoothly, all across. The station similar scenes were playing out as merchants and traders discovered that the humans who had always been there, handling the difficult routes and managing the complicated logistics and moving cargo on time every single time, were suddenly gone, and the economic structure that had been built around their reliability was falling apart like a house made of cards. Merchant Prince Kaleth, who was one of the richest and most powerful traders in the galaxy, called an emergency meeting in his private chambers, and 20 other wealthy merchants gathered there representing different species and different interests, but all sharing the same look of worry on their various faces. Kaleth did not waste time with pleasantries and said they needed to resolve this situation immediately by opening direct communication channels to Earth and offering humans whatever they wanted to come back. One merchant objected and said that Speaker Vorath had forbidden any private negotiations with Earth, but Kaleth roared back that the speaker was not watching his personal fortune disappear into nothing. and Kaleth himself had 300 active contracts that all depended on human shipping, and if he could not fulfill those contracts, he would be completely ruined, along with everyone else in the room. Merchant Lady Syrah, whose cybernetic eye glowed with rapid calculations, agreed and said that human shipping had been undervalued for years because the humans made everything look so easy that people forgot how difficult it actually was. And now, no one else could match their efficiency because the Threxians charged too much money, and the Dalthians were too slow, and the Vraxians refused to service the dangerous outer rim routes that humans handled without complaint. Meanwhile, at Research Station Sigma, which orbited a distant star and served as one of the Assembly's main scientific facilities, the xenobiology community was having their own crisis about Earth's departure. Dr. Zeleth, who was a famous Assembly scientist, sat in his laboratory staring at a message from his human colleague, Dr. Gregory Pierce, and the message was short, but it hit Zeleth hard as he read the words saying that Gregory was sorry to end their collaboration this way, and perhaps someday the Assembly would realize that real partnership required equality, and, until that day came, humanity had to walk its own path, and the message ended with Gregory telling his old friend to stay curious. Attached to the message was the complete data set from their joint research project on quantum biology, and it was carefully organized with detailed notes and recommendations for future experiments, and it was far more information than professional courtesy required or than Gregory had any obligation to provide. Zeleth realized with a sick feeling in whatever organ served as his stomach that the humans had always been more generous and more helpful than the Assembly deserved, and now they were gone. His research assistant came into the laboratory and stated the obvious by saying that the humans were gone and asking what they should do now. Zeleth said quietly that they would continue their work as best they could and hoped that the politicians did not destroy what the scientists had spent decades building together. But the impact was not limited to economics and science, because on the frontier world called New Harmony, where colonists from a dozen different species had built a settlement far from the core Assembly worlds, people were watching nervously as human security contractors packed up their equipment and prepared to leave. Governor Pelath, who was responsible for the colony's safety, confronted the human team leader, who was a woman named Ashley Barnes, and he said that she could not leave because the colony had hired her company to protect them, and they had a legal contract that was still valid. Ashley checked her datapad without looking up and said that Article 17 subsection C of the contract allowed either party to terminate the agreement if political circumstances beyond their control made it necessary, and the United Earth government had issued a mandatory recall of all citizens in Assembly space, so the humans were leaving whether the governor liked it or not. Pelath's voice cracked with desperation as he said that the Krellin pirates had been testing the colony's defenses for months, and Ashley's people were the only thing keeping the raiders away from the settlement. Ashley finally looked up and met his eyes, and her expression softened just a little as she said that her team had trained 60 of the colony's own people in defensive tactics over the past year, and they were leaving behind detailed tactical manuals, and the perimeter was secured with automated defense systems, so the colonists were not completely helpless. Pelath said that they were not soldiers and did not know how to fight, and Ashley replied that humans had not been soldiers once either, but they learned because necessity had a way of teaching hard lessons. And she paused before adding more gently that she was sorry because this was not their choice, and her team had actually liked living on New Harmony. As the human ships lifted off from the colony's landing pad and disappeared into the sky, the colonists watched them go with fear in their hearts, and similar scenes were happening on 72 other frontier worlds where humans had been the reliable workers and the dependable guards and the willing partners in all the difficult, dangerous tasks that other species tried to avoid. Now the humans were gone, and the empty space they left behind was much larger than anyone had expected or prepared for. Back on the Assembly Station orbiting Centris Prime, Speaker Voreth called an emergency session of the full council, and the chamber was even more chaotic than it had been when Ambassador Carter had made her announcement, because now the consequences were becoming real and visible. Voreth commanded everyone to be quiet and said they needed to address the crisis in a systematic way. But Councillor Threx laughed bitterly and said this was not just a crisis, but a complete catastrophe, because humans had been embedded in every single aspect of Assembly operations, And now supply chains were collapsing and frontier colonies were vulnerable, and the entire shipping network was falling apart. Counselor Venn spoke carefully and suggested that perhaps they should reconsider their position and send a diplomatic delegation to Earth to offer some kind of compromise that would bring the humans back. Counselor Mara's scales flushed dark with anger as she said that humans had defied the assembly and they could not show any weakness now, or other species would think they could do the same thing. Merchant Prince Caliph, who had been granted special permission to speak, stood up from the observers' gallery and said loudly that they could not afford to let pride get in the way of survival, and every single day that humans remained outside, the assembly was costing his guild millions of credits, and this was not about politics anymore, but about basic economic survival. Speaker Vorath's crystal body dimmed as he thought about the situation, and the human departure had exposed a truth that the assembly leadership had refused to see for 30 years, which was that humanity was not just another minor member species, but had become essential to the galaxy's daily functioning. The assembly had always viewed humans as junior partners who were useful but controllable, and who should be grateful for the privilege of membership. But now the assembly was learning a painful lesson, which was that humanity had been quietly holding up more of the structure than anyone realized. The humans had done their job so efficiently and so quietly that no one noticed how much depended on them until suddenly they were not there anymore. Vorath announced that the assembly would send a diplomatic mission to Earth, not to demand their return but to negotiate new terms for cooperation. And he said it appeared that they had badly underestimated humanity and what they were capable of. Counselor Venn said softly that calling it an underestimation might be the biggest understatement anyone had made in 1,000 years. And several other council members made sounds of agreement because the truth was obvious now, even if it had not been before. The galaxy had taken humanity for granted, and now the galaxy was paying the price for that mistake. 3 weeks after Earth's dramatic withdrawal from the Galactic Assembly, Secretary General Marcus Webb stood inside the newly built embassy of independent Earth on the neutral world of Frontier's Edge, and this planet was located exactly halfway between the major assembly territories, which made it perfect for negotiations because it had declared neutrality centuries ago and maintained that status through careful diplomacy and smart political maneuvering. Ambassador Helen Carter, who had been promoted to Chief Diplomatic Officer for all of Earth's foreign relations, stood beside Marcus and observed that the assembly delegation was late, and she said this was obviously a power play designed to make the humans wait and feel uncomfortable. Marcus replied calmly that the assembly could play whatever games they wanted, because Earth held all the important cards now, even if the aliens had not figured that out yet. Deputy Ambassador Kyle Rogers was reviewing information on his datapad and reported that 17 frontier colonies had reached out directly to human corporations in the past week, completely bypassing the assembly, and these colonies were offering premium rates for shipping services and security protection. Marcus asked what response Earth had given to these offers, and Kyle said that human companies had been instructed to say they were open to future negotiations once the situation with the assembly was properly resolved, because Earth did not want to appear to be stealing the assembly's clients even though the clients themselves were doing all the approaching. Marcus smiled slightly and said that was a wise approach, and he asked Helen what her assessment was of the assembly's current position. Helen said bluntly that they were desperate because their economy was stumbling badly, and the merchant coalition was losing enormous amounts of money every day, and the frontier colonies were terrified of being left unprotected, and the military factions were making aggressive noises but were unwilling to actually start a fight. And meanwhile, the political moderates in the assembly were gaining more support for reconciliation with Earth. Marcus said that in other words, everything was going exactly as Earth had predicted it would go. Helen confirmed this and explained that humanity's quiet efficiency over 30 years had made Earth indispensable to the galaxy's functioning. But the aliens had never noticed because humans never made a big fuss about all the work they were doing. The door chimed and a diplomat from Frontier's Edge announced that the assembly delegation had finally arrived. Marcus straightened his suit jacket and told the diplomat to show them in. The assembly delegation was larger than Earth had expected, with Speaker Vorath leading the group, and he was accompanied by Counselor Venn and Merchant Prince Caliph, and surprisingly also by General Thrax, who was the highest-ranking military officer in the entire assembly. Marcus greeted each of them politely by name and offered refreshments, and the next several minutes were filled with formal diplomatic pleasantries that both sides knew were necessary before getting to the real business. Finally, Speaker Vorath stopped the small talk and said directly that the Assembly wanted to discuss terms for humanity's return to membership. Marcus said pleasantly that there seemed to be a misunderstanding because Earth was not interested in returning to the Assembly under the previous arrangement that had existed before. Councillor Venn asked what kind of arrangement would be acceptable to humanity then. Helen activated a holographic display that showed a detailed document and said that Earth had prepared a proposal for a new relationship framework. And instead of Assembly membership, what humanity was suggesting was a bilateral treaty of cooperation and mutual benefit between two equal powers. The document appeared in front of each alien delegate, and as they read through it, their expressions changed from confusion to surprise. And in Merchant Prince Caleth's case, what might have been grudging respect showed on his features. Speaker Vorath said slowly that Earth was proposing an equal partnership rather than membership, and this would be an alliance between sovereign powers rather than Earth being a member state under Assembly authority. Marcus confirmed that this was exactly correct, and he explained that humanity would maintain complete sovereignty and independence, and Earth would cooperate with the Assembly on matters of mutual interest, including trade and security and scientific exchange and cultural programs, but humans would not subject themselves to Assembly authority or accept Assembly restrictions on their development. Councillor Mara objected and said the Assembly could not function if its structure became fragmented this way, and if they granted humanity this special status, then other species would demand the same treatment. Helen said calmly that perhaps those other species should be granted similar status, and maybe it was time for the Assembly to evolve from being a governing body that controlled everyone into a coordinating organization that facilitated cooperation between independent equals. Councillor Venn murmured that this was a revolutionary idea, and Kyle added that it was actually just logical, because the current system bred resentment and stifled innovation, and he asked how many species had experienced breakthrough discoveries that were blocked because the Assembly deemed them destabilizing, and how many colonies struggled because Assembly regulations made efficient solutions impossible to implement. General Thrax, who had been silent until now, spoke in a deep, gravelly voice and asked what guarantees Earth could offer regarding their military capabilities, because human technology represented a significant power imbalance that made other species nervous. Marcus replied that Earth was willing to share defensive applications of their technology with allied species, and this meant things like shield systems and early warning networks and logistical support, but not weapons, because what humanity wanted was partners, rather than subjects or enemies. Speaker Vorath asked a blunt question, which was why humanity would offer cooperation, instead of simply using their superior technology and growing economy and clear strategic advantages to dominate the galaxy. Marcus leaned forward and said that Earth had learned something important from their own history, which was that dominance never lasted but cooperation could be permanent, and humans had watched empires rise and fall on their home world, and every single empire that relied on force eventually collapsed, but alliances and partnerships and relationships built on mutual respect could endure for generations. He gestured to Helen, who pulled up historical data from Earth showing the rise and fall of various human civilizations, and Marcus explained that in Earth's 21st century humanity had faced a critical choice between competing for dwindling resources and risking extinction or cooperating with each other and reaching for the stars, and humans had chosen cooperation, and while it had not been easy and certainly not perfect, that choice had saved the species. Marcus said that Earth did not want to dominate the galaxy, but only wanted the freedom to grow and explore and contribute as equals alongside other species. Merchant Prince Caleth made a sound that might have been laughter and said these were very idealistic words, but he had noticed that the human proposal included extremely favorable trade terms for Earth's shipping and logistics services. Marcus smiled and said that humans were cooperative but not stupid, and yes, Earth expected fair compensation for their services, but he pointed out that the proposed rates were 30% lower than what the Threxian Shipping Consortium charged and came with much better reliability guarantees. Caleth countered that Earth could afford to undercut other companies because of superior technology, and Marcus agreed, and said that was true, because human efficiency and advanced systems allowed Earth to operate at larger scale with lower costs, which meant lower prices and higher volume and better service for everyone. And that was not exploitation, but simply good business practice that benefited all parties involved. The negotiations continued for many hours, with the assembly delegation proposing modifications and the human team making counter-proposals. And slowly and carefully, a framework began to take shape that might actually work for both sides. As the sun set outside the embassy windows, Speaker Vorath sat back in his chair and said that he would need to consult with the full council before making any final decisions, but he believed this proposal had real merit, even though it would require significant restructuring of how the assembly operated. Helen said that change usually did require restructuring, and she added that the assembly's current crisis had not been caused by humanity leaving, but had only been revealed by that departure, because the system had fundamental flaws that were always there, and Earth had simply exposed them by walking away. Councillor Venn admitted that this was uncomfortably accurate, and he said the assembly leadership had been aware of growing dissatisfaction among many member species for decades, but had simply refused to address the underlying problems. Marcus suggested that perhaps Earth's departure was the catalyst the assembly needed to make necessary reforms, and he said that humanity had not wanted to cause harm, but also would not accept continued subordination, and this new framework would allow both the assembly and Earth to move forward stronger than before. 6 months after Earth's dramatic withdrawal from the Galactic Assembly, Ambassador Helen Carter stood inside the newly constructed Unity Hall on the neutral world of Frontier's Edge. And this building was special because it had been designed and built by both human architects and assembly engineers working together, which made it a physical symbol of the new relationship that was taking shape between Earth and the rest of the galaxy. Today was the official signing ceremony for the Frontier Accords, which was the treaty that would redefine humanity's place among the stars. And the hall was filled with representatives from across known space, including human delegates sitting beside their assembly counterparts, but now as equals rather than as junior members who had to follow orders. Media drones from 100 different worlds floated through the air, capturing every moment and broadcasting the ceremony to billions of beings who were watching this piece of history unfold in real time. Secretary General Marcus Webb stepped up to the podium first and addressed the crowd by saying that 6 months ago, humanity had made a very difficult choice to leave the Galactic Assembly, and Earth had not done this out of hostility or anger, but out of necessity, because humans needed to stand on their own feet and prove to themselves and to the galaxy that they were capable and independent and worthy of respect as equals. He paused and looked around the chamber at the diverse crowd before continuing that some people had called Earth's decision reckless, while others had called it arrogant. But he hoped that today everyone could agree it had been necessary because the old system was not working well for anyone, not just for humanity but for many other species as well. And the Frontier Accords represented something completely new, which was cooperation without subordination and partnership without dependency. Speaker Vorath approached the podium next, and his crystalline body was brighter than it had been in months, which perhaps reflected a renewed sense of purpose and hope for the future. And he said that Secretary General Webb was correct in his assessment, because humanity's departure had forced the Assembly to confront some very uncomfortable truths about how the organization had been operating. Vorath gestured toward the assembled delegates and explained that the Assembly's structure had become rigid and inflexible over thousands of years, and the policies that were meant to maintain order had instead become stifling, and somewhere along the way the leadership had forgotten that real strength came from diversity of thought and approach, rather than from forcing everyone to be uniform and follow the same rules. He announced that the Frontier Accords would establish humanity as the Assembly's first independent ally under a completely new type of relationship, but he also said that the treaty established a new category of membership for any other species that wanted greater autonomy while still maintaining cooperative ties with the larger galactic community. And already 7 different species had formally expressed interest in transitioning to this new status. This announcement caused excited murmuring throughout the hall, because people were realizing that the Assembly was transforming itself from a controlling hegemonic structure into a genuine alliance of independent powers who chose to work together. In the audience, Captain Ryan Hughes sat with other military officers from both Earth's forces and the Assembly's security divisions. And beside him, General Thrax was watching the proceedings with an expression that looked like satisfaction on his alien features. Thrax said quietly that humanity had forced a necessary change to happen, and his military analysts were projecting that the Assembly would actually be significantly stronger within 5 years because of these reforms, rather than weaker. Ryan replied that he certainly hoped so because a weak and unstable Assembly would serve nobody's interests, including Earth's. Thrax agreed and then asked in a casual tone whether it was true that the newest Earth vessels could cross the entire galaxy in only 3 weeks of travel time. Ryan smiled and said that unfortunately those specifications were still classified information that he could not discuss. Thrax said of course he understood, but speaking hypothetically, if such capability did exist, then it would completely revolutionize defensive positioning and rapid response throughout all of known space. Ryan said that hypothetically, yes, that would be true, and also hypothetically the defensive assistance provisions included in the Frontier Accords might allow for sharing such technology with allied military forces at some point in the future. Thrax made a clicking sound with his mandibles that Ryan had learned meant amusement, and the general said that he believed he was going to enjoy this new arrangement very much. Meanwhile, in the commercial district of Merchants Gate Station, which was thousands of light years away, businesses were thriving under the new management structures and reduced regulations that had been implemented, and Merchant Prince Kaleth was reviewing his profit margins with something that approached genuine joy. His assistant Vora reported that the new shipping contracts with human companies had increased their operational efficiency by 47%, and the Assembly's recently reduced regulatory burden had cut their costs by 23%, which meant profits were higher than they had been in decades. Kaleth admitted something he never thought he would say, which was that the humans had been completely right about how markets should work, and he said that lighter regulation combined with genuine competition produced much better results than controlled markets and mandated cooperation. And he asked with heavy sarcasm, who could have possibly known this would be true? Vora pointed out that several economists had actually predicted exactly this outcome years ago, but they had generally been ignored by the Assembly leadership. Kaleth said that, well, the leadership was listening now, and he instructed Vora to draft a proposal to the Commerce Guild because he wanted to expand their partnerships with human corporations, since these people understood trade and business in ways that the Assembly had never grasped. On Research Station Sigma, the scientific community was celebrating for their own reasons, and Dr. Zeleth was reconnected with Dr. Gregory Pierce through a holographic communication link, and their joint research project on quantum biology was resuming with even more enthusiasm than before. Zeleth said excitedly that he had made several breakthroughs in the quantum biology applications that Gregory had suggested months ago, but he needed his human colleagues' input on some complex energy transfer mechanisms that he could not figure out alone. Gregory pulled up their shared data files and studied them for a moment before saying that he thought he could help, and he asked whether Zeleth had considered applying some principles from their earlier work on faster-than-light spatial mechanics, because the underlying mathematics were actually quite similar. Zeleth's form brightened with sudden understanding, and he asked why he had not thought of that connection himself, and he said that the entire scientific community was grateful that humanity had not completely severed all ties when they left, because when the humans departed, the Assembly had lost its most innovative and creative research partners. Gregory said that Earth scientists were glad to be back in contact as well, because science should not have borders or political restrictions that prevented the sharing of knowledge. Zeleth said that speaking of collaboration, he had been authorized to invite Gregory and the entire human research community to join the Assembly's new Advanced Research Initiative, which was a joint program between 5 different species, and the Assembly wanted humanity to be a founding member of this program. Gregory grinned and said he would forward the invitation to Earth's Research Council, but speaking personally, he was confident they would approve because the scientific community on Earth was very eager to reconnect with their colleagues across the galaxy. Back on Earth itself, in cities and settlements across the planet and throughout the solar system, public opinion had shifted dramatically from the initial fear that people felt right after the withdrawal to a sense of pride as humanity's bold gamble paid off in visible and measurable ways, and economic indicators were strong and new colonies were growing rapidly, and the respect that Earth now commanded in galactic affairs was undeniable to everyone. In the Global Assembly Complex in Geneva, where Earth's unified government met, the United Earth Council was reviewing the achievements of the past 6 months, and Commerce Director Lisa Hamilton reported that trade with independent worlds had increased by 200%, and Earth was now the preferred logistics provider for 70% of all frontier colonies. General Frank Morrison added that military recruitment was up by 40%, and these new recruits were not just signing up for defensive duties, but because young people wanted to explore and be part of humanity's expansion into the wider galaxy. Dr. Alan Price reported that scientific cooperation had reached levels never seen before with active joint research programs involving 43 different alien species, which was up dramatically from only 12 programs under the old Assembly membership structure. Council member Patricia Green smiled and said that it seemed Ambassador Carter's bold decision to walk out of that council chamber 6 months ago had been exactly the right call.